Good afternoon, and thank you for joining me. We're here to talk about my good friend, the late Dr. Samuel L. Blumenfeld. In fact, we're here to establish, and are establishing, the Dr. Samuel L. Blumenfeld Literary Foundation, which hopes to and will further Sam's extraordinary work. Sam's been a guest on this program. He passed away recently. I want to welcome Bill McNally. He's the president of the Blumenfeld Foundation.
Nice to be here, Chuck.
Thank you, and we all knew Sam Blumenfeld. Jack McManus is here. He is the president of the John Birch Society. John, thank you for joining me.
My pleasure, thank you.
And Sam was a longtime friend. Sam's work on the surface of it got into this business of phonics and how phonics has been undone by the education establishment. He goes through the history of that and how that's led to a dumbing down of this country, how it's led to illiteracy. Because after all, English is a phonetic language. You learn English by sounding out the vowels and the consonants to make words so that you can read properly and read on your own. And Sam shows how, starting with John Dewey back in the turn of the 19th century, there was a deliberate and conscious effort to replace phonics and then to mix phonics up with what's been called various things over time, whole language, look-say, and what that is basically is guessing. It's basically taking entire words and asking the reader to guess them like they're hieroglyphics, like they're pictures. It's obviously not what English is. That's what Chinese is, which is fine because it's a hieroglyphic language. But English is a phonetic language. All of the Romance languages and Germanic languages are phonetic. And so to teach English like you're looking at hieroglyphics is something that the advocates of that understood consciously would result in a breakdown of the ability to read properly and would eventually lead to such ailments, as Sam points out, as dyslexia and ADD and other problems that our young people are now dealing with. Bill, talk a little bit about Sam's research and how he came up with this extraordinary body of material.
You know, it's very interesting how Sam came about it. In Hartford, Connecticut, there was a school called the Hartford School for the Deaf and Dumb. It was directed by a Reverend James Gallaudet. Now we're talking in the period of around 1830. At that time, of course, a person, when they use the word dumb, they mean that they couldn't hear. So he said, well, why don't I just show people words and have show the people a picture with the word, let's say the horse, and have a picture of a horse. And of course, they could then learn to read. Well, he thought, why don't I try this on normal children? I mean, he didn't have anything devious in mind. He just thought it would be good, right?
Sure.
And so he introduced it into the Boston school system on or about 1837. Now, at that time in Boston was run by the Boston schoolmasters. There was no NEA, no union, no American Federation of Teachers or anything. But the Boston schoolmasters accepted Gallaudet's, he called it the Mother's Primer. And in it was the hieroglyphics of learning to read. Well, by the time 1844 rolled around, after it had been in the Boston schools for about 5 to 6 years, it was a complete disaster. Children couldn't read, and luckily, since the Boston schoolmasters had control, they took it out. They said, this
Sure.
has got to go. And it went into someplace, into hiding, and never resurfaced until possibly maybe Dewey found out about it.
Dewey in the 1890s, 1900s. And just as a little sidebar there, we should note that back then, school departments were very much controlled by the parents who elected the local school board members. The school board members were often parents themselves, who had children in the schools. There was a vested interest. There was local control. It was democratic. It was not the kind of thing which it was run by Washington or it was run by bureaucracies that almost operate in sovereign nature and have agendas. Parents knew what the education was. They trusted themselves to make the proper decisions about the education of their own children. I mean, I suppose in the broad political sense, back then we had much more of a sense of trusting ourselves to govern ourselves. We didn't feel that we needed these quote-unquote experts, this expert class. Now, Dewey comes along, who was an avowed socialist, who visited Russia and sat at the foot of Stalin looking up lovingly, who wanted to transform America, into a province of the world and into a socialistic entity. He wrote an article, and Sam uncovered the work on this, called The Education Fetish, where he says that education is too focused on reading, why are they focused on such things as reading? We should get away from reading and get more into teaching behavior. And he also went on later and criticized such things as the father-headed family, the church, business, all of these things as being, that should be replaced by what he called fusion, which is to say, to create this new kind of man, more pliable to his internationalist fantasies. And Dewey is viewed as the father of so-called progressive education. He spawned a whole school of people who came after him, who gradually took the high ground in education. And today, they dominate the entire education establishment. And it's no longer something that's run by local school boards. It's run by the NEA, which is an unelected body, an unelected union, and the Department of Education, which was put in under Jimmy Carter. And it's really out of the control of parents. Jack McManus, you have delved into this issue in your many books on economy, on politics. Do you see a parallel between what Sam's research indicates regarding the takeover of our education system by these unelected bureaucrats?
Oh, absolutely. I remember coming across one of Sam's early books called Is Public Education Necessary?
One of my favorites.
It's one of my favorites, too. I've read many books. But what interested me, as you were talking, is to recall the fact that the man who founded the John Birch Society, Robert Welch, before he founded the society, was a top official and executive, really, representing his own company in the National Association of Manufacturers. Mm-hmm. And he got himself appointed as the education specialist within the NAM. And he said at one point it took almost 2 years for him to convince the other leaders of the NAM that the parents are essentially the teachers of the children, not the state. And he eventually wrote some about that. Then he even wrote a book called The Romance of Education, mm-hmm. which I had a hand in having it published. But and then in 1958, he founded the John Birch Society as an educational organization.
Right. I mean, he was a great.
And there was nobody I ever knew who was more confirmed with the need of people to be able to read. In fact, we came up with a slogan that said, "Those who will not read have no advantage over those who cannot read." Mm. Right?
That's right. And obviously, when you have an authoritarian system where people become resources for the state, then it's a good idea to basically break down the building blocks of reading. And so now we have young people, and I mean, I've known young people like this in my own family. They have trouble comprehending when they read a book. They don't like to read. And it's because they were taught this crazy mix of phonics and whole language, which is actually worse than just pure whole language because it even confuses a person more. And Sam pointed out that this could be solved very simply by use of phonics. He developed a system, alpha phonics, right. Which Sam Blumenfeld also is one of those great unsung heroes because Sam played a major role in the establishment of the modern homeschooling movement. And that was a movement by parents who could see how corrupt the education system had become. Originally, it was mostly conservatives, but today a lot of liberals also are getting involved because we all care about our children. We all care about making sure that our children are not being deliberately corrupted and dumbed down by this education, what Sam called a conspiracy, and I think rightfully, this education establishment that literally is trying to short-circuit our citizens' ability to think cognitively and to think clearly, and reading is a basic of that.
Well,
Bill?
we can remember, Chuck, back in 1950s, in around 1950s, there was a gentleman by the name of Dr. Rudolph Flesch. Mm-hmm. He studied this problem of reading, and he wrote a book, Why Johnny Can't Read. And in it, he explained the problems with looking and trying to remember words and getting away from this phonics. So after that book was printed, I believe Sam was asked by Watson and Washburn if he would join the Reading Foundation. And Sam said, well, what are you doing? He says, well, we're trying to get phonics back in the schools. Because now, you see, as you said earlier, it's a psycholinguistic guessing game with the whole word. However, we should add that a student can learn to what seems to be faster with the whole word for a short time, but then at the age of 10, let's say, maybe the age of 9, this block comes in, this learning block. Whereas, okay, in Sam's books here, the alpha phonics, they're learning to attack the words so that then they can read. They're going to be slower.
But they can sound out the words
properly. They sound
properly.
out the words. And look at this book. There are no pictures in here.
That's right. No Dick and Jane.
No Dick and Jane, whereas you see in the other pages. Now, the difference between these two books, this is Sam's original book, the Alpha Phonics program.
Right.
And now the Blumenfeld Foundation in Windham, New Hampshire, now this book can run around $25. This book is now $9.95.
Right. We're not supposed to mention price on the show, but that's okay.
I mean,
but going back
it's
to...
cheaper.
It's a good deal, and check it out. Going back to the business of what Sam also discussed with regard to reading, it was more than just the introduction of look-say as a deliberate method of disrupting a person's ability to read. And Sam talks about how this was done both by what we euphemistically call the right and also the left. The left being the John Deweyites who wanted world socialism, the right so-called being people like Carnegie and the industrialists who wanted a more pliable workforce, people who would check the, punch a time clock and who were not innovators, not thinkers, which is what reading does. It makes you a more sovereign person. You can have more determination. That they all supported this sort of educational modality, this creation of this human resource. And that Sam also brilliantly pointed out that it's more than just a matter of reading that's been interrupted. What this has done, and Sam documents this very well and pulls down quotes from respected educators in the process, is it's created a lot of the social ills that we now have in society. It has created not just dyslexia and ADD, or it's advanced those things, but it's created a lot of the problems that young people are dealing with in terms of depression and emotional problems, and just all of the dislocation that takes place as a result of not having these basic tools to think clearly, to think cognitively. And so thus we have a whole industry building up around that of people who take care of the problems that they created. And some of those ways of taking care of it, for example, is to give people psych drugs to help deal with the problems that they created. And that's leading to suicides, it's leading to homicides, a lot of these school shootings and these murders. If you take a look at them, I think it's fairly well documented that 9 out of 10 of those cases involve somebody who was on one of these drugs. Exactly. And they were either dealing with withdrawal or they'll even tell you on the fine print on the thing, could lead to suicide or homicide. I mean, so, they created the poison and they ended up the same.
And they took God out of the schools.
Which is obviously something Sam gets into at length. And they took the idea of sin was replaced by the Unitarian idea of, education to create perfection on earth. Now, Ms. McManus?
Let me interject here. I had an occasion several years back to have a group of college graduates come and join a kind of a study group that I started, trying to get them to appreciate where our country was going and how far down it was going. And I decided at the beginning that we should study the Constitution of the United States. And to do so, everybody had a copy of the Federalist Papers. Now, the Federalist Papers, as you know, of course, were written to explain the Constitution to the people in the state of New York so that they would persuade their legislators to ratify the Constitution. Most of them were farmers, right? So I gave the book, I said, okay, let's start off with Federalist number 17 or whatever. 1 week later we gathered, and not one of those college graduates had read and studied what I had asked them to look at.
Right.
It was too difficult for them.
Sure.
Right?
Sure.
The Federalist Papers, written for the farmers in New York State in 1780s, most of whom never went to a school, never entered a schoolhouse, were taught at home by their parents or their preacher or somebody. They could handle the Federalist Papers,
Right.
but the college graduates of today couldn't. What a lesson that taught me.
Why? It obviously shows that the country at the time of the founding was
Better educated.
far more literate, far more educated. If you take a
Yes.
look at the letters people wrote, they were head and shoulders above anything you see now.
Right.
And that things like, memorization, things like declamation, things like rhetoric, all taken out of the schools. You can't get a constitution in the schools. You can't mention the word God in the schools. And it's been...
You can't teach the Declaration of Independence because it says we are endowed by our Creator
Exactly.
with rights. If you can't, then where do you get your rights? Well, the conclusion that people come up with is the government gave them to me,
state.
and if the government gives them to you, the government can take them away.
That's right. I mean, that's the ultimate socialistic idea anyway, that rights come from the state, from a man-made entity that
Right.
can run by so-called enlightened people.
I like to refer to that portion of the Declaration of Independence as the thunderous assertion in the Declaration, right?
Yes.
Men are endowed by their Creator
Creator.
with certain unalienable rights. I mean, there's the basis of our country right there.
It is. I mean,
Yeah.
that
No other country started that way that
And by
I
the
know
way,
of.
that concept came right from the Bible.
Yeah.
When God created man and women in his image,
Right.
he basically endowed individuals with the responsibility of sovereignty with him as sovereign. And that not this man-made state, every individual was unique, was sui generis. And that the socialistic mindset wants to replace that with the state run by enlightened so-called people who have this sort of secret knowledge of they're smarter than the rest of us.
Dewey.
Right.
Like
Dewey and
John
Horace
Dewey.
Mann.
Like
yeah.
John Dewey is a classic example of that, and a lot of the educrats of today. And I think that today's educrats, most of them I think are unwitting at this point. I think that the Dewey philosophy has become so pervasive and so overwhelmingly powerful in the society, and that there's this understanding that people have from an early age that if you oppose it, then you're going to get in big trouble.
It's a politically correct kind of idea, except it's educationally correct. Right.
That's right.
Right.
And that the idea is that we are not to, and it sounds almost strange to say this because people are scratching their heads. Well, what do you mean we're not supposed to be fully successful and accomplished people? But that's what it is.
Yeah.
And Sam shows this in his books. He shows how John Dewey wanted to tear down the institutions and the ideas that would make us fully conscious, sovereign individuals fulfilling our own destiny, whatever that might be. That could be, you could be a CEO, like Sam used to say, the CEO of a corporation or a beach bum. It was up to you. You had the ability to think cognitively and craft your own life. They wanted to get rid of that. They wanted to create human resources. They want to create this conformist, massive, semi-hypnotic movement where people would all become...
Chuck, you're probably familiar with William Shirer's book,
Yes, The Rise and Fall of the Third
The
Reich.
Rise and Fall
Sure.
of the Third Reich. I was fingering through that recently, and I came across a portion where some of the Nazi leaders talked about education. And he said it was enough for them to be able to count from 1 to 100. And we have to be careful not to educate them too much, because an educated person is a potential enemy. Mm-hmm. Right?
Yeah,
It was classic. And I just wrote about this in one of my blogs. And it just shows the mentality of a totalitarian. Doesn't want people educated, especially educating themselves, wants them to be drones. All right?
Good.
Drones,
It's a good
drones
image
for
of it,
for the Third Reich or whatever.
Sure. I mean, the first thing the communists would do when they take over a country would be they kill the intellectuals. First, what they did in Poland, that's what the Cat and Forest Massacre was all about.
Right.
Anyone who is thinking on their own, these are people who like to pose as, unique thinkers, when in fact the opposite's the case. I mean, this is a massive conformity, and if somebody thinks on their own, if they step outside the box, they're going to get vilified. And I think that that's a message that goes across to people at a young age. The awards are if you genuflect to the left, and if you think politically correct, you're going to get the goodies. You're going to you'll have better dates, you'll have a better career. Whereas if you don't, they always make an example of somebody who comes along who doesn't. It's a little subtle message that this is what happens when you don't do it. And it creates and Sam has written about this too, it's a Pavlovian reaction. Pavlov was a scientist who, even though he was an anti-communist, he was supported by Lenin and Stalin financially in Russia. And he did experiments on his dogs, where he would create reactions from stimuli, positive and negative, over time. And it's kind of a mass hypnotic system that I think the Soviets spent a lot of resources developing. Very much the practice of socialism, how to control the means of communication, how to control people like their cordwood. And I think that same message, that's what political correctness is all about. It's not legitimate.
Political correctness is tyranny.
Yeah, it's oppression.
Yeah.
It's not, we're afraid to engage in a reasonable and rational and polite discussion that involves dissent, because it has nothing to do with that. It has to do with controlling more than what people say. It's ultimately controlling what people think.
I had an experience recently. I talked to a young fellow who's teaching in the public school system. And I asked him, well, what do you teach? Well, he said, I'm teaching civics, or the equivalent of it. Forgotten what he called it. He didn't call it civics. But I said, well, do you teach the difference between a republic and a democracy, and how our founding fathers gave us a republic and feared democracy? And he looked at me like I was from Mars. So I explained it a little bit to him, and he began to understand it. And then I said, well, now you're going to pass that on to your students, aren't you? He said, you want to get me fired?
Exactly.
If you teach the truth, you're going to get fired, is what he said to me.
That's right.
Right. So I wrote a little book about that called A Republic If You Can Keep It. It's absolutely stunning to go and find out that our founding fathers feared nothing more than democracy.
They created a republic. It's for the republic for which we stand.
The rule of law versus the rule of the mob.
Exactly.
Which is what it's all about.
That's right.
So there's a very thin book I wrote. I do write larger books sometimes.
Sure.
But that's a thin one.
Yep, especially your book on money, one of my favorites.
Financial terrorism.
Yes.
Yeah.
Bill?
Chuck, I wanted to explain to the viewers how the brain works and why this whole word method is dangerous to a learner, someone who's learning to read. Okay, see if you can follow me. Here I have my hand on the right lobe of the brain, let's say, this half here. Well, that is what takes in sight. I can see you, I can see pictures, art. Then on the left brain takes in sounds. So what we want in a child learning to read, if he looks at words and tries to guess at them, his right brain is going to be used in place of the left brain, when the left brain is not going to hear the sounds of those words, and he's going to develop a reading problem. It won't happen exactly early in the childhood, but eventually, let's say maybe a couple years into it, he'll get into a stumbling block. And they have now shown with scientific method brain scans showing that the left brain is not developed. How they do it, I don't know, but they can see the right brain is more developed in those children that are using the whole word, and so they are at a disadvantage. So
Sure.
That's important to understand, that this phonics.
No, I mean, so it actually has physical ramifications. It becomes wired, because phonics is something that equally balances both sides of the brain, because you're using both visual and you're using sound. It doesn't, which is what the brain should be. I mean,
Right. And you don't want a conflict within the brain trying to look at words.
No, I mean, the brain is a bicameral instrument.
And this will help the brain, this phonics method will help the brain develop the proper way of reading when they attack those words. So he goes through these small words like I have in the book. Cat, shows you the sound of the C, the sound of the A and the T, and then when you put it together, ka-at, and then cat. And then the person can see catastrophic, he can see other words, you see?
Cataclysm.
Cataclysm.
Yeah, catatonic.
Catatonic.
But look, I mean, the point is that Sam has personally worked with people who had reading problems of all ages, and the results were extraordinary. We're going to take a brief break. Before we go, Bill, let people know about the Sam Blumenfeld Literary Foundation.
Okay, the Samuel L. Blumenfeld Literacy Foundation is in Windham, New Hampshire, and it publishes this book here, Phonics for Success, The High Road to Literacy Made Easy. And it's available on Amazon. And our website is SLB, Samuel L. Blumenfeld, LF, literacyfoundation.com. That's what, and if you go there, I can, I'm not sure right now we could do this, but we could get you a full-blown free download on this, on Sam's dissertation on dyslexia, or can dyslexia be artificially induced in the schools? Yes, says researcher Edward Miller. That's going to be available free. And so maybe if you don't get all the details, you could contact Chuck and you could tell them how to get there, and I'll give you those web links and they can download that. It's a beautiful read.
Oh,